it's now an expectation that they have this information at the ready because the customer's actually asking for it. Whereas 10, 15 years ago, they could communicate what they chose to know about the coffee.
This is Keys to the Shop, episode 529. Today we're talking with the editor-in-chief of Standart Magazine, Luke Adams. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DiFirio. I am your host for the show. And as always, I'm excited to have you here. If you are new to the show or have been with the show for a while, thank you for tuning in, and do subscribe. Subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on your podcast player, share these episodes far and wide. It really helps the show greatly. And if you've really been helped by the show with the content, then do me a favor and give us a 5-star rating or review either on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That helps as well. Thank you so much. Now, a couple of things. One, you know that you can always reach out to me, Chris, at keystotheshop.com for one-on-one coaching and consultation for your cafe team. We do leadership workshops. We also do training, as well as the one-on-one consultation to help coffee shops either start or existing shops become better. With cafe assessments and remote coaching, I've been able to help lots and lots of coffee shops over the many years we've been doing this. Maybe this is something that makes sense for you. If you're interested, if that sounds like something you'd be curious to learn more about, reach out, Chris at keystotheshop.com. We'll just have a conversation and chat about what's going on, how I can help, and whether it makes sense to work together or not. Now, also, you have about a week and a half or so, give or take, to sign up and apply for key holder coaching groups, these mastermind groups of coffee shop owners that gather together for each other's edification, insights, help problem solve, and just support and make each other successful. We've been running these for 3 seasons now. The 3rd season has really just ended this week. And now the 4th season is going to be happening starting in the beginning of April. So if you want to sign up for this, if you want to apply to be considered for membership, go to the show notes. You'll see a link right there in big bold letters. Or again, just reach out, Chris at keystotheshop.com. If you're a coffee shop owner, we want you to have had at least a couple of years of experience of running your cafe. That's really the only requirement that we have. Besides that, let's have a conversation. So anyway, hope to talk to you soon. Now, today's episode is brought to you by a couple of great sponsors. We have Arto Brick. You find them at Arto Brick on Instagram. And Armin is a great guy. They run a wonderful family business in LA with tile and stonework. And of course, we've got the barista series from Pacific. That is the plant-based beverage, just standard, right? And so I think that we're going to have fun talking about them later in today's episode. But for right now, I want to introduce today's guest, and it is a returning guest, returning from ages of, I think it's been 7 years since Luke Adams, who is the editor-in-chief of Standart Magazine, has joined us on the show. Standart Magazine is a wonderful coffee magazine. It's more than a coffee magazine. It's a cultural digest. It's something that has curated content that connects people to the stories of the humans in coffee and other adjacent issues that surround coffee, using coffee as a means to have bigger conversations. And I am subscribed to the magazine. It is always fun to get this because it is very well put together, very well curated. The stories and the content are very enriching and sometimes challenging. So you've got some entertainment, you've got some enrichment, some edification, some challenge mixed in there. And over the years now, it's been 10 years since Standart has been producing this print magazine. What Luke would call slow journalism has led to a very thoughtful approach to topics that deserve a lot of thought. It's one of the things I really love about Standart, not the least of which, of course, is because they also send coffee with their magazine, and it's fun to get that coffee. So anyway, big fan of what they do. That's why we had them on the show all those years ago. But now Luke is back on the show because they've celebrated 10 years of Standart, and they've produced kind of a retrospective, a book, a special book with a collection of articles and some other goodies that Luke will talk about here in this episode. But beyond that, today, we're going to be talking to Luke about his perception of the industry and his insights into the narratives that are happening in the industry, a little bit of future forecasting of coffee, a little bit of retrospective, and a lot of deep diving into the movements of coffee and how they affect the people of coffee, baristas, owners, farmers, and everywhere in between. So this, just like the magazine, was a really enriching conversation, and I really appreciate Luke joining me again for this show. So let's get right to it. Here now is my conversation with the editor-in-chief of Standart Magazine, Luke Adams. Luke Adams, welcome back to Keys to the Shop. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me again.
Of course. Yeah. It's only been 7.5 years or so. Time flies, I suppose. And congratulations on 10 years of Standart.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
What is the official 10-year anniversary, if I may ask?
Oh, goodness me. That's a tough one. Well, from starting the company, it would have been, I think, late 2014, actually. So sort of November, December 2014. But then issue 1 was published in, I think, the second quarter of 2015. So it would be, depending on how you look at it, it's either now or a few months ago.
So the original episode that we had you on was titled Standing for the Art of Coffee. And we talked a lot about the magazine. We talked about the point of it and the nuance it brings to the industry, the stories. And I really like the tagline of Standing for the Art of Coffee, especially in a... it's funny, if you have a channel on YouTube, you really want to get a lot of views, you do gear reviews.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
It's very technological. But then there's the art. There's an art to this that feels a little bit more satiating to the soul of the person who is in it. And it's always struck me that that's a consistent theme of your magazine and the things that you select to put in there. And so today I was wanting to kind of follow up, because I know you're putting out a special issue or a book of some kind with the 10 years being the focus. What's going to be in that? What would we expect from that?
The idea behind the book was initially we thought of publishing a sort of hardback volume of a selected number of articles that we published over the first 10 years. But then that felt maybe just a little bit lazy. And we wanted to introduce an additional concept to the book to make it sort of fresh and worthwhile. And the concept that we arrived at was a lengthy photo essay. We sent a photographer around to various cities in Europe, and we asked her to select the best seat in the cafe, and a number of cafes in each city. Mm-hmm. And the idea was to try to express one of the overarching themes that has steered our editorial content over the first 10 years, which is really using coffee as an approach to get to something else beyond coffee. So coffee really treated as a means rather than an end in itself. And by going into a coffee shop, selecting that seat with maybe the best view of the square outside or the best view of the queue to enable the photographer to people watch a little bit, we tried to get that idea of coffee being a starting point from which you can see other things that might be of interest. And then we tried to capture that photographically in a combination of, I think we used 35 mil film as well as Super 8, and then took the stills from the Super 8 video to try to give it a bit of a nostalgic vibe. Nostalgia was another element, naturally, because we were looking back on the first 10 years. Sorry, that's the first section. The second section is a selection of articles from over the course of the first 10 years of Standart, and their authors giving some fresh commentary, looking back on that article that they might have submitted to us 10, 9, 6 years ago, and offering some reflections on whether or not they've changed their mind, whether or not they would have written the text in the same way or not. So it's a kind of omnibus, I guess, a shortened, truncated omnibus, but with something new added. In this case, the reflections of the authors of the original pieces. And then a third section is a collage of illustrations that we've published over the years in Standart. So it really is reflective of the fact that we do try to steer editorials away from coffee as an end, as I say. And that's probably why we've tended to focus on the stories of the people more so than gear reviews or anything too technical or newsy. One of the reasons is there are people out there on YouTube doing gear reviews that are doing it incredibly well. I don't think we want to even try to compete with them. on that front. And the other reason is in a print-only magazine such as Standart is we want to try to offer something that you can't really get online. And so it really is trying to put stories out there that benefit from print and that maybe slower mode of consumption as opposed to online digital consumption.
You've created a bit of a world and culture with the editorial decisions that you've made over the years and the allowances that you've given to authors to influence that. And it strikes me as a similar or a parallel to the way a coffee shop that operates with integrity to its vision, but also allows staff and customers to shape it over the years. If you're reaching the 10-year mark of a coffee shop that looks back in the same way, inevitably would probably, if they can say that they're really proud of everything and they're feeling pretty fulfilled about it, it seems most likely that they were not treating the cafe as the end in itself in a way, or the point is not just to have a business. I'm just happy to have a business, a coffee shop, or for you, it's a magazine, whatever it takes to get eyeballs, to produce content. So as much as it's not coffee as an end of itself, it's not a coffee shop as an end in itself, or a magazine for that matter. And so how do you, in that course of time, think that you have managed to stay on a pretty steady course with integrity to that original vision amidst all of the pressure to be successful within that niche of we're a magazine, or for a coffee shop, we just have to survive, and rather make it more of an artistic pursuit to a larger end?
Well, I think there are similarities with how we try to put together the magazine and a coffee shop, for instance, because those coffee shops that, to say the most successful coffee shops, I'm not sure, because it depends how you want to measure success. But the coffee shops that I want to spend most time in are those that seem to be sort of community hub and offer somewhere that people can come and connect over a cup of coffee. And I think because we focused on coffee as something that can connect us to other people rather than be the only thing we write about, it's sort of a bridge between, might be a producer in Guatemala and a reader in San Francisco or something. There's a commonality there, which is coffee, but ideally we want to tell a story that is going to be different and new and novel to the reader. And maybe in trying to, I don't want to come off as sort of sounding too arrogant about it, but perhaps Standart's success has a little to do with the fact that we focused on the coffee as a bridge as opposed to coffee as a subject, if that makes sense. Trying to connect people through that common interest and then tell stories that are perhaps not even related to coffee. Coffee is usually more of a motif than an overarching theme in a lot of the articles and interviews that we tend to publish.
So now the idea of the content of your magazine is that there's a variety of things covered. And sometimes there's a little bit of a helpful and benevolent challenge that's offered in the content. And at the same time, there's things that are just kind of, they're feel-good stories, they're enriching, but sometimes things are very challenging. So how do you go about selecting the issues that you feel need to be presented in a challenging way in the magazine so that hey, this is going to be helpful because this is of the moment? Maybe it's about pricing crisis on farms or something culturally related to barista training. Where does that fit in when you think this is something that's ultimately going to be helpful, even though it might be challenging, it's a necessary addition?
There is a kind of pressure to try to find that balance because we have from time to time got feedback from readers to the effect of that was a little bit too challenging or too upsetting. And, I really want to feel rewarded and made to feel happy in reading this magazine. It's something of an escape for me. One piece that I can remember, or a theme that we covered in one issue, was history. I think the long form piece for that issue was looking at decolonialism and the sort of colonial scars that coffee still suffers from. And we got feedback, not saying that the article was bad. I mean, I think it actually won an award that year, a Sprudgie or something, that particular article, but it was divisive. So I think when you take a sort of risk like that and try to put a really challenging piece out, maybe you try to balance it out in an issue to make sure that there's some sort of lighter pieces, not for the reading experience overall to be too heavy, I guess. Mm-hmm. So that's one way to get a challenging piece into an issue, is try to surround it by pieces that are not going to maintain that mood necessarily. I think they might have more impact that way. We try not to be too newsy because we're quite sort of slow journalism-ish in our approach. again, there are a lot of coffee blogs out there and newsletters that tend to do the sort of newsy element of coffee very well. And that's not sort of what we go in for. The other side of it, I think, is to make sure always, even if you're introducing a subject that might be challenging or difficult to read, you try to give the reader a reward for their sense of curiosity. So you want to give them a sense of discovery in anything that you're publishing. Or that's what I try to do anyway. When I'm looking at an early draft, say, or a submission or a pitch, I really try to identify a piece of information that a reader, having digested themselves, would like to sort of repeat to their friends at the pub later on. So something that was really a reward of their sense of curiosity, such that they want to repeat that fact or repeat that finding or even repeat that image they read in the piece.
That makes sense. Just yesterday, I was listening to somebody talk about how to read the books that you have before buying new books, which is an issue for a lot of people who are into reading. And the idea was people like to have read a book.
Sure.
And sometimes that prevents them from actually reading through the whole thing. And the idea that you're talking about reminds me of that, because then it's an idea that sticks with somebody. You might have had a hard slog going through the decolonialization article, but at the end of it, it does feel maybe more informative than if you were just, you knew which kind of hand grinder to buy.
Yeah.
Right. So It's not comfortable, but you have gone through it and maybe enriched yourself in a way that you wouldn't have chosen for yourself, if not for the fact that you have a subscription to this magazine that offers you some things that are curated for that purpose.
Yeah.
You are, of course, then throughout 10 years of Standart, you have access to a lot of different thoughts in the industry. You've curated this magazine and edited a lot of different think pieces. What to you feels like the standout theme of the last 10 years of, like, this is a big question, of the coffee industry as it relates to people who would consider themselves engaged in wanting to build a better coffee industry? What stands out is sort of the, people, you like to use the word waves, but the movements that are happening that are significant enough to take note of?
Sure. I think probably the largest theme has been a move towards easier communication between producers and consumers. 10 years ago, I hadn't heard of anybody really, unless they were kind of a green buyer or had spent time in a producing country and had developed contacts there, reaching out to a coffee producer, asking about their coffee, who's going to be roasting it, where can I get it, I live here. And really, the facilitation of that connection has been probably the biggest change. And a related theme to that we've covered a lot, it's unavoidable actually, is the empowerment or the importance of the empowerment of the producer in a sustainable coffee sector. So those two are the real standout subjects, I think.
Specifically, the last one you mentioned, the empowerment of the producer. Whenever we use this term, empowering our baristas, for example, in the coffee shop, we love the word and we say we want to do it, but the practicality of it's a lot more complicated. And I'm curious if there has been anything that you've seen as been more promising than not related to actual empowerment and what it means for the farmer, related to the supply chain. What does that look like based on what you've published thus far?
I think the producers that perhaps have felt some success and have felt empowered to an extent that they didn't several years ago that I know and speak to, they tend to say it's about access to information and education that they might not have had 10 years ago. That might be SCA courses. It might just be a blog. It could be reading a newsletter, YouTube, all of these media on which they can find educational resources is something that comes up time and again from producers. I don't want to speak for producers. I can only sort of relate what they've told me that's important to them in their own empowerment. Possibly at the consumer end, what we do need to look at pretty quickly is being willing to pay more for coffee. And we've been saying this for at least the last 10 years. And it's still pretty difficult, but I think there are some promising signs, particularly over the past couple of years. I mean, I live in London, so it's a big city, so maybe it's happening here before it's likely to happen elsewhere. But there are a few shops that are really offering, well, super high-end coffees in order to justify the price. But I think it's more the fact that by offering those super rare coffees at a cost maybe of 4 times what you might be used to paying at a coffee shop, it's easing people into the fact that coffee can actually be something worth spending money on. And I think that's always been a bottleneck for the industry. I mean, people talk about, oh, we need to pay farmers more, we need to do this and that. But if we're still only willing to pay $3 for a coffee and no more, where's the money going to come from?
Well, here's where I'm curious. Is the high-end coffees offered as a means to justify the higher price, which in some way is great as a training mechanism, but in the cost of goods related categories, maybe it's no one's really paying percentage-wise more than they would if they paid less for a not as high-end coffee, for example.
Yeah.
Is it helpful to ultimately keep high-end coffee as the representative of high coffee prices? Or should we be celebrating and respecting what we would consider, air quotes, lower end coffees, the Weiwei Tenangos of the coffee world that could have, and this is just a little of my opinion, if we celebrated them a little bit more within our own culture to the customer, we could have justified COE prices for those coffees long ago, but we've kind of got a very narrow range of what we're willing to charge, and it has to be very expensive, rare coffees and funky processing methods.
Cool.
So are we due, and what is your opinion on this, to break out of the gold bars of this little like high-end coffee prison to apply it to lower scoring coffees that are delicious to the consumer?
Yeah, I think we are due a change. I understand why we've been speaking about this for so long, and it's because so many coffee shops are really, in business-wise, quite a precarious situation most of the time. And you need to be cautious about how much you can charge for a cup of coffee, given your location, perhaps the clientele. And there was a cautiousness there not to price the coffee too much above chain coffee for so long. And I think this was something that people thought would allow people to be introduced to specialty coffee more easily and to make it more accessible. And there's an argument that maybe we needed a period of that in order to kind of get people to appreciate better coffee. But I think that has to be well and truly over with now. And one of the encouraging signs I'm seeing is that some of the more successful specialty coffee kind of micro chains, or in some cases, big chains, they've got to the point where they're no longer in a precarious situation with regards to whether they're going to go bankrupt or whether they can afford the rent on the unit that they're in. And so they can afford to be a little less cautious. And this is at the moment where I'm seeing some of those higher prices being offered. And the baristas that I speak to working at those chains are saying that people are sort of ready and willing to maybe experiment in paying a little bit more for coffee. They're also starting to charge at the bottom end more than certainly a Starbucks or a Costa or a Nero or one of those chains.
Yeah.
So that's encouraging. And maybe that means that the smaller independent specialty coffee shops might now not have to take that risk if those bigger specialty chains have taken it for them or have been able to take it where they couldn't. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case, but that's maybe an optimistic way of looking at some of the signs that I'm seeing that people are willing to pay a bit more.
I like optimism. I feel it's helpful.
Well, these days we could do with a healthy dose of optimism, sure.
Yeah, of course. And just as a side note, I feel like optimism gets a bad rap sometimes because people imagine that it is devoid of recognition of issues. But I think it's born from the acceptance of issues, and it's a next step towards solutions, which we need a lot of. Because speaking of content, there is quite a lot of content that is critique, and it's necessary critique, but to produce momentum forward towards solutions where we introduce higher prices for coffee and it's sustainable, where we accept the colonial history of coffee and then create with more consciousness something that's a better alternative. That's not the same as simply complaining online, for example, which is why I like the idea of slow journalism. It doesn't remove the emotion from it, but it seems to make the emotional response a little bit more of a tool for building rather than despair.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. It's a happy coincidence that we were sort of forced to go in for this slow journalism approach because of the nature of the publication being print only, and the nature of getting that out to an international readership simply takes time. So we've always had to be very mindful of the fact that if we publish something that's too of the moment, we know that the reader's only going to be reading that in maybe 2 or 3 or even 4 months. So that has kind of forced our hand a little bit with regards to the approach, the slower approach. But it's also one that I think houses many benefits, such as not really engaging in the kind of meme-ish culture of online sort of debate. those discussions, I think, come and go too quickly. They don't allow you to get too deep into an issue because there's going to be another news story or something that's going to take your attention away, the next day or the next hour. And there's also the nature of those online debates tend not to be conducive to depth of conversation, but rather kind of hot takes and, gotchas and this sort of thing. It's not a good way to explore an issue, I don't think. So perhaps in offering a slower take on some of these stories, it might offer something like a period of reflection that I hope is useful to continuing conversation and discussion on some of these subjects. But I don't know. Again, I'm being optimistic. I hope that that's the case, but I can't be sure.
Well, hey, everybody. We're going to be right back to our conversation with Luke. And I just wanted to take a second to talk to you, like I said, about our sponsors. Today, Arto Brick in LA, Armin and his brother Vad are running that. Their father started it many, many moons ago. And it was a family business dedicated to tile work and stonework, hard surfaces that make beautiful, unique spaces, whether that's residential or professional. And they've done many coffee shops. They've worked with many different architects to outfit these spaces so that they stand out. This is what we want for our coffee shops, right? We want to stand out in the materials we use matter. Just like the coffee, the customer interacts with all of it, right? So Arto Brick on Instagram, at Arto Brick. You can see arto.com is their website, but best on Instagram to follow them and reach out to Armin. Armin was a past guest on the show as well, talked about the story of what they do. And if you've got a coffee shop project that is on the horizon and you really want to stand out and make it unique and beautiful, Arto Brick is in your corner. So check them out on Instagram at Arto Brick. Now, we're also sponsored today by our friends over at the Barista Series from Pacific. You can go to pacificfoodservice.com, get samples, try it for yourself. It stands up to the heat from steaming, produces great texture, keeps the flavor balance focused on coffee. It is made for baristas. It is a performance beverage. So the people judging that performance are people who have discerning palates, very fine-tuned skills. They know what they want, and that's why the product really is as good as it is. So check them out again at pacificfoodservice.com if you're looking for the best plant-based beverages to serve your customers. Check out the Barista Series from Pacific. So with that, let's get right back to our episode talking with Luke Adams. If people have stuck with your publication for 10 years, of course, that implies that they're 10 years older. And over time, people become mostly more mature. And we would never have admitted it in the early years of our career, all the hubris and things like that. But later on, you're like, yeah, I was a little bit this way or I was a little bit that way. And now I have a little bit more wisdom so I can actually take what I've learned where I wanted to act on what I learned earlier. I didn't really have the means or the maturity to sustain my action to any meaningful end, but now I do. Similar to anybody who runs a business now, they say, I'm a completely different owner or a different barista, in fact. And I'm curious if you've seen a bit of a tide change in the way that the industry, represented by the people doing the articles for the magazine, view themselves over the years, whether you've been able to see some kind of a maturation of perspective in the way that people approach subjects rather than maybe compared to the beginning or even what you yourself have seen outside of the magazine and the industry, before the magazine.
Well, this came up, of course, when we were putting together the anniversary book and asking the authors of those articles from years ago to reflect on those articles, what they said then and whether they changed their opinion. A sign of their maturation, I suppose, was I got a lot of commentary back from the authors saying, oh, goodness, I'm so embarrassed that I seem to be so sure of myself on that point, that I really should have looked into this matter a little bit further. And I wish I'd sort of been or recognized my naivety a little more than I was willing to back then. The other unfortunate kind of theme of those discussions with those authors was that nothing that they'd hoped would change has actually sort of changed. So they're really saying, oh, I wish, we're still in the same boat. This hasn't changed or hasn't changed enough. So that was a little bit upsetting. But I think embracing ignorance and embracing naivety a little more, being open to learning well, and supporting others' openness to learning by being as transparent as you can with what you're doing and not gatekeeping. I think that's been something that's changed in the past 10 years is there have been a lot of efforts towards greater transparency and less gatekeeping on the part of coffee educators or people doing work across the supply chain. Well, that's been really, really nice. And I think that's been a hugely positive change. And a sign of maybe the maturation of the industry as a whole, as opposed to individuals within it.
Yeah, well said. I think one thing I've maybe mentioned a while ago was the idea that the industry is diverse. It's just not put up on a platform as much as it could be. So when we talk about diversity and culture, et cetera, when we highlight stories, when we investigate, when we make assumptions and then just kind of roll with them, it gives a image that is born from maybe expediency and not really a disciplined pursuit of what is actual. What is true about the coffee culture in a different continent.
Sure.
You might assume that it's not as much because you're familiar with your own. And so that it strikes me as helpful to showcase the things that exist parallel to your own world, in that you can just say, hey, this industry is very large and has more to it than I originally assumed. And maybe we can assume also that, and this is some hope to give to the people who feel a little bit, they're despairing that nothing has changed, right?
Sure.
We talked to Thalion Tremaine of Pachamama a while ago on the show, and he had mentioned that when they first started the company and he was made president of this farmer-owned supply chain, they wanted to be a 100-year company from the beginning, which means you're not going to know very much about them
Sure.
initially, because there's a lot of work being done. So I'm curious about some of the things that you might think maybe there's work being done, or it's so important that I can't waste time on a meme, or I can't get online and post every day on Instagram about this. We just have to get to work. But another thing that I might be interested in here is from the perspective of baristas that write articles and give their perspective on the industry. I'm curious what you see happening with coffee shops. This can be born from what you've seen of people who've written articles for Standart, or you live in London and you can sense the direction an industry is going a lot if you live in a place like New York or even LA or London. So we talked about the farmers, but then the representatives of the coffee to the public have a very big part to play in this. What does it look like now for the barista craft versus when Standart first started? Has it improved? Is it more professional? Is it less professional? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's much more professional. And I think the role of the barista as a kind of conduit between, let's say, the producer and the customer, as the dynamic has shifted a lot, because I think 10, 15 years ago, depending on where you live, the role of the barista in delivering information about the coffee was sort of barista-led in a way. They were sort of telling the customer about the origin of the coffee or the particular coffee, whether the customer cared or not. That was because specialty was newer. Those who were working as baristas in specialty cafes were really excited about sharing that knowledge and the stories behind the coffee with customers. Now, I think coffee has been subsumed into a wider culture of sort of foodieism and people just caring more about where everything they consume comes from. I think, therefore, now baristas are, first of all, expected to have more experience and more to say about a particular coffee, particularly if you're offering a menu of 10 coffees. I mean, the baristas need to be trained up and willing and ready to offer some pretty in-depth information about a given coffee. It's now an expectation that they have this information at the ready because the customer's actually asking for it. Whereas 10, 15 years ago, they could communicate what they chose to know about the coffee. So in that sense, I think the pressure on baristas is greater. But I also think because of that pressure and customer interest, you might call it an increased professionalism, a wider role for the barista, which is not just about making coffee or pulling shots, but really educating and providing an experience, and often a learning experience for the customer.
Yeah, the industry has kind of forced their hand. And if a self-starting barista would educate themselves and everything there, not every owner, and this is maybe a message to owners out there that offers a 10 coffee menu, does the work to educate and train people to be successful in that. So it's a facilitation thing too that requires a professionalization of coffee shop ownership rather than an expensive hobby for a lot of people. Ends up being more or less that entered into with a little too quickly. and we've done a couple of episodes related to this, but the business of coffee, we had Maxwell Dashwood talking about the business of coffee talking about the next, again, with waves, we need to make profit. We need to be healthy. We need to be equipping and resourcing. And you bringing this up is perfect because the barista is under a lot of pressure because of all of the innovations that have happened and the menus expansion and options. So even more so, owners, let's step it up and really equip those baristas to be successful.
Yes. Well, this is not so much future looking, so I don't think I even need to call it pessimistic. It's just realistic. The fact that we pay our baristas as an industry so poorly, that's something that I wish would look different now than it did 10 years ago. But most baristas in London, for instance, make minimum wage. And I think that's probably true of most of the US as well. And in two countries that are two of the richer countries on earth, a role that has become rapidly more professionalized. The fact that we're still paying baristas and happy to pay baristas minimum wage is absurd. It would be a very, very welcome change, but perhaps also one that requires our being willing to pay those higher prices for coffee at the consumer end. And I'm not sure how else to get to a point where we can afford to offer careers in coffee that are rewarding, where people, don't have to live in a share house with 5 other people or have absolutely no chance of ever owning a home. These things are scary. It's got to be part of the solution for the long-term success of the industry. We talk about new generations of producers moving away from coffee at the producing end of the supply chain. I think we're risking that taking place at the barista end of the supply chain too, if we can't find a way to make coffee jobs on the whole more rewarding. And that's pretty scary.
Yes, I would agree there for sure. We do have, and the scary part to add to that is there's a lot of technological solutions that are there to cover up the issue itself of, well, we're not going to innovate ways to make that happen, but we will purchase a super automatic espresso machine to replace our workforce and not have to train them as much. And therefore, we just need to stay in business. Back to the idea of, is the point for you just to stay in business, or is it the type of business that you're doing? And if it's the latter, then it seems like then you would innovate towards people and not away from people and make that a reality, which kind of leads me to one of my final questions here, which is you publish this magazine now that allows people to kind of be challenged, meditate on an idea for a little bit, let it sink in. And that seems to indicate that there's more likely a chance that they would take action on a thing if they're presented with it. We all have a little bit of power to use to change things as individuals. So in the next 10 years, how do you hope people will read the magazine in a way that will affect some of these changes, that will bring about action versus passively reading and kind of forgetting?
One way that I hope to maybe facilitate a reading culture among standout readers in 10 years would be to focus on what differentiates people more than what makes them similar, when focusing on the stories of people whose lives coffee touches a great deal. Just seeking for the commonality between people across very diverse lives kind of glosses over some of the ways in which coffee touches those people uniquely. So I think trying to really go deeper into the ways in which people across the supply chain are different rather than similar might offer a deeper understanding of life in different parts of the world and for different people involved in coffee. The other thing that I try to facilitate, will continue to try to facilitate, is, as I say, that sense of a reward for curiosity on the part of the reader, and offering little facts or little tidbits or little stories or scenes or images that people want to repeat naturally. That's one of the limitations that we have with print only, is usually we're only having one reader per copy. And we don't have maybe the same reach or at least rapidity of reach that we do online. So trying to tell stories that people naturally want to speak about to their friends and that drive conversation as a means of expanding that reach. And also, I guess, in facilitating conversation as opposed to online quick commentary. So those are two ways that I hope we'll be able to continue the conversation in a positive direction over the next 10 years.
I love it. Well, it's been wonderful to see everything that you've been able to accomplish, you and the team there, and the contributing authors throughout these years have made, as anything that goes out, you have to have a little bit of faith that the ripple effect is more positive than you get wind of
Yeah.
with responses and emails saying how they appreciate it. You put it out there, you're sowing the seed, and sometimes you don't see what comes back. But I can say I think that the quality speaks for itself, and the change is happening, and it takes a lot of people doing similar things to you. And I'm sure you've inspired a lot of conversations in the last 10 years and will many more. So I would invite you to kind of give us some direction on where we can go to subscribe to the magazine, and then stay tuned, especially for when, or maybe this book has already come out and I just have forgotten, but how we can get our hands on that.
Well, the book was slated to come out much earlier than it wound up coming out, owing to a number of logistical issues, but it is out and it's for sale at standartmag.com. That's also the easiest way to subscribe and to learn a little bit more about the magazine. The other way is, as everybody knows, is Instagram. Our Instagram is, I think, at Standart Mag, and that's where you can have a bit of a look and see if it's of interest and something you might like to explore further. And, well, thank you for saying those very, very kind things. It brought a smile to my face. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Luke, for joining us again on the show. I'd say let's do this again in another 7 years, but maybe it'll be before that.
Perhaps.
Yeah. Thank you again. I appreciate your insights here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
All right. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. And I hope that this conversation and the way we were talking about thinking about things and writing about things has inspired you to continue your own conversations, to dwell on a subject for lengths of time, to push against kind of the memification of our thought processes, and contribute a lot of your own content and just thought to these issues. Because, not to use the phrase of this show, but you do have the keys to the shop or an issue, a fill in the blank, whatever it is. When we are sat over a book or a magazine reading about an issue, and it gives us pause, there's something magical that happens when we can't just click our way away from it, or we can't just immediately retweet or repost it. It forces us to reckon with the information, which is a great way to listening to voices. We have couple of times past guest on the show, Oscar Trimbley, who wrote books on deep listening, slow journalism, contemplation, and taking wise and intentional next steps with information that confronts us, challenges us, encourages us, all of it. It doesn't have to just be bad information or challenging information that we feel compelled to act on. We can still be compelled to act on things that make us feel good, and we can pass that good feeling on. This is why I love what Standart does, and they really are standing up for the art of coffee. And so thank you to Luke Adams for joining us on the show. If you want to stay in touch with what they're doing, subscribe to the magazine. Go to standartmag.com. You can pick up the book as well there at standartmag.com. And as always, if you have any questions or feedback from me, you can email chris@keystotheshop.com. If you're interested in coaching and consulting, let's talk. If you want to be considered for membership for the Keyholder coaching groups coming up very quickly here, go ahead and email chris@keystotheshop.com. And with that, I say thank you. Don't forget to subscribe and all that jazz. I really hope that this was edifying, encouraging, and as always, I hope that it truly has given you keys to the shop.